morning, everyone. I know I'm not the usual BB at 9 face, but I'm welcoming you from the IODSA this morning. We have a fantastic topic today for Boardroom Bites at 9. I'm stepping in for Vakeshni this morning, and she's taken a well-deserved break. We have a topic today: behavior drives results, which will be presented by Dr. Mark Vella. The topic today is a very interesting one, and I think that it needs to be close attention needs to be paid to the subject matter of this particular topic, because I think it's something that we really need to focus on. Behavior fundamentally creates or destroys value. While technology is a great enabler and human capital is a great asset, it is effective, ethical, and courageous behavior that converts them to results and value. Behavioral and emotional intelligence can be learned and developed. It can improve bottom line results, performance, and social impact. It can attract and retain talent and create competitive advantage. And yet, because it is still regarded as a soft skill, it's paid lip service, addressed vaguely, and left to HR and employee assistance programs to manage. It should be part of your strategic imperative in the VUCA landscape. Dr. Vella is the managing director of Sapient, a consultancy whose work is based on the premise that behavior drives results in organizations and individuals. Additionally, Mark is co-founder and director of moveanatomy.com, an online education platform for exercise professionals. As an independent non-executive director, certified and registered with the Institute with the IODSA, Mark sits on boards and committees in various sectors. He joins us this morning to talk about this very interesting and pertinent topic. Mark, would you turn on your camera and your sound? I'd like to hand over to you so if you can take us through this presentation. I just want to remind all our audience members, you can chat through the chat box, keep everything professional and polite, and all the questions go into the Q&A for Mark to address after he has presented his slides. Mark, I'm going to hand over to you. Enjoy your session and enjoy the audience. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to share my screen, so let me do that. Just confirm to me that it's come through.
If you can just put it into presenter mode. Perfect. Thank you very much.
There we go. All right, so welcome everybody, and thank you for taking time to be here. I hope today is of value for you. My intention is not to build a business case for behavioral intelligence, but rather to share with you some insights and concepts around the building blocks of behavioral intelligence so that it may benefit you as a director, as a colleague, and as a partner, a life partner, and just on a personal level. Behavior is a deep and broad topic, and it can be very challenging. I invite you to lean into the subject, but know that if anything we discuss today is of particular relevance to you and it's something you want to speak a bit more about, you're absolutely welcome to reach out to me, and my contact details will be at the end of the slide presentation. During lockdown, it seemed like the whole world went online, and education was no exception. From homeschooling through to corporate training, literally overnight, education platforms and startups were born. And into that sector, there was tremendous investment, financial investment into these startups. And this sector, which we call the ed tech sector, in other words, education technology sector, rapidly gained traction and investment. And to give you an idea, in India alone in 2021, you can see the massive jump in investment into edtech jumping to $4.7 billion. But just a year later, the signs started to show that these investments were not working out. And in fact, if we look at a selection of IPO edtech stocks over the last year, ending this year in April 2022, you can see some of these stocks dropping as much as 80% in value. So the question may be asked, how did this come to be? How did such a massive failure come to be? Some may cite inflation. Some will say it's the war in Ukraine. If you speak to some of my insider colleagues, they might say to you, well, typically the valuations by both the investors and the investees into the sector were overzealous. Others will tell you that operational costs in managed online education don't scale very well. In other words, as you grow in revenue and as you grow in number, you literally have to have more operational staff and you raise more operational costs to match that growth. So as a result, unfortunately, stock values drop. Now, there must have been some very smart people sitting on various committees, investment committees and boards, approving these acquisitions, these investments. And so one could say that, in a way, these decisions were a failure of governance. But I would propose to you that because boards are made of people, it's fundamentally a failure of behavior. The root cause to this issue is behavior, because the sum and weight of people's behavioral intelligence in boards will directly reflect in the outcomes and results of the board. Essentially, to have ethical and effective governance, as it's stated in the King Code, really requires us to have ethical and effective governance. It's a bit like a gym membership. Just because you sit on the board, it's like having that gym membership card in your pocket. It doesn't necessarily mean you use it. It doesn't necessarily mean you apply that governance. And so the proposal to you today is that the development of more effective behavior through behavioral intelligence, emotional intelligence, will definitely improve the function of governance and board directors. I could have raised multiple examples to you of conflicts and wars, of local SOEs and corruption. We could have spoken about social issues in our society, such as gender-based violence or early childhood development in education in this country. And for all of them, we would have found that the root cause to these problems lies fundamentally in behavior. Does drive results at all levels, from government right through to communities and boards, both private and public. And it's a horizontal. Like tech, it pervades every layer and function of an organization. The argument is often that tech is a great enabler, is that really it drives results, but I would say to you it's a great enabler. And whilst human capital is a great asset, both of these are converted into real value through behavioral intelligence. It takes effective, kind, and courageous behavior to really leverage them effectively.
Mark, would you like to run a poll now?
Yes, thank you for the reminder. You know, I'm off at the races. So yes, there's a poll that's coming up, and the question really is, before we go any further, looking at your own organization, how often would you say that behavioral or behavioral intelligence is a decisive factor in your board outcomes? How much of a role does it play? Just looking at the poll answers coming through. So it's amazing that nearly 70% of you said that 60% of the time or greater, it is a factor. Thank you. It's going to be interesting. We might do this poll again at the end. Julie, I'm just going to move forward with the presentation itself. No doubt some of those poll results will still come in. So if we just have to revisit, you know, the question as to why is it so imperative to really develop behavioral intelligence, not just as a nice to have, but as a fundamental skill. South Africa remains one of the most, in fact, the most unequal country economically, according to the Gini coefficient. And really, time and again, we keep on applying the same old thinking to our problems. We expect different results. If we're going to change that inequality and so many other issues in our society, we really need to start with a new level of thinking. Last month, the presenters really eloquently explained the concept of the fact that technology is exponential and that boards really need to change the way they approach this exponentiality in the way they conduct their decision making. But the thing that I would really like to emphasize and share to you and add to what they've said is that humans are linear. And whilst technology is exponential, for us to try and be like technology is a mistake. We are never going to compete with technology effectively, and we should not try to do that. Rather, intelligence, emotional intelligence, is what's going to help you to successfully navigate that sort of disruptive gap between this very exponentially changing, rapidly changing, volatile world and your own personal development. And what's going to really give you the resilience to deal with that and to be very adaptable to that environment is going to be behavioral intelligence. Every 5 years, the World Economic Forum prints a set of skills, top 10 skills it believes are critical for the next 5 years. And in 2020, every one of those top 10 skills literally falls within the domain of behavior. There's not one tech skill in that list. And then perhaps to sum it up, in the words of Daniel Goleman, who wrote the original book, Emotional Intelligence, which years ago when it came out, sounded a bit like an airy-fairy concept and nowadays is a fundamental for many organizations. He said, if your emotional abilities aren't in hand, if you don't have self-awareness, if you're not able to manage your distressing emotions, if you can't have empathy and have effective relationships, then no matter how smart you are, you're not going to get very far. So in being able then to maybe break this down practically, I've said to you that fundamentally leadership and governance abilities are underpinned by behavioral intelligence. And so what I want to do here in this slide is break down for you the building blocks that lead to effective behavioral intelligence. And perhaps the way that I can ask you to imagine this is as a building where governance and leadership sit on the top floors. And what we're going to do is we're going to slowly work our way down the building towards the foundations and slowly but surely see the connections between each building block of this matrix. So in order to govern effectively, we could say that you both need to have the qualities of leadership as well as to be able to work and perform within a team. In turn, the ability to perform within a team and lead is going to very much rely on your own ability to excel and perform well with your own and resources. Your ability to perform with teams is very much going to be underpinned by ability to form and develop and manage relationships effectively. And further to this, it's going to rely on your ability to really understand people and understand them as separate to yourselves, to be able to sit with them and to be aware of them. In turn, this is going to rely on your ability to manage your own emotions, to contain yourself, to manage your energy, and to regulate and take responsibility for your behavior. And then finally, we reach that very bedrock fundamental foundation, self-awareness. Self-awareness is directly correlated to your effectiveness as a leader and a governor. And as I'll point out just now, if you were to work in no other area today or any other takeaway you take away from today, it's that self-awareness is the foundation building block on which you can drive behavioral performance. Julie, if I can suggest that we maybe then do that second poll, and it would be interesting to know from this poll, in which of these domains or building blocks do you feel that particularly holds you back or are particularly challenging for you? You know, if you were to able to sort of wave a magic wand, go in there and address one of these, which one is particularly challenging for you? Just looking at the poll results as they come through. It's in some ways quite evenly spread, but it's interesting to note that relationship management is almost that pivotal, almost that sort of perhaps like a keystone effect between your own abilities and then the abilities to relate and manage and work with others. Julia, again, I'm going to just move on. I see that about 2/3 of the people have answered the poll. I'm going to go forward again, but it'll be interesting to see how those results finalize out. So the first block, and what I'm going to do now is we're going to go on a little bit of a whistle-stop tour of some of these building blocks, and I'm going to share some concepts and insights that I think may be of value to you. But I really want to point out that it's a bit of a cherry picking of these blocks. I've picked things that I think are relevant, that are not necessarily always raised, or some things that people ask a lot about. But there will be room later on. I'll actually show you a lot of the topics that I didn't raise, and I'm really happy to talk about them in the Q&A. So self-awareness is very much the ability to recognize your behaviors, understand their origin as well as their effect on others. And the first exercise that I'd like you to do in today is take a look at this video and observe who you think committed this crime. Who did this?
Somebody in this room murdered Lord Smythe, who, at precisely 3:34 this afternoon, was brutally bludgeoned to death with a blunt instrument. I want each of you to tell me your whereabouts at precisely the time that this dastardly deed took place.
I was polishing the brass in the master bedroom.
I was buttering his lordship's scones below stairs, sir.
Why, I was planting my petunias in the potting shed.
Constable?
So type in the chat who you think committed this crime. Let's take a look what they say.
Arrest Lady Smythe.
But how did you know?
Madam, as any horticulturist will tell you, one does not plant petunias until May is out. Take her away.
Sorry, madam.
It's just a matter of observation. The real question is, how observant were you?
And action.
Clearly, somebody in this room murdered Lord Smythe, who, at precisely 3:34 this afternoon, was brutally bludgeoned to death with a blunt instrument. I want each of you to tell me your whereabouts at precisely the time that this dastardly deed took place.
I was polishing the brass in the master bedroom.
I was buttering his lordship's scones below stairs, sir.
Why, I was planting my petunias in the potting shed.
Constable, arrest Lady Smythe.
It's easy to miss some things that you're not looking for. Now, exercises like this before, but the reality is very often we are incredibly selective in what we notice and what we see, and miss a lot of what is in fact quite present. Jodie Pickett, the author, really said something quite profound. She said, we believe what we want to, what we need to. The corollary of this is that we choose not to see what we'd rather pretend doesn't exist. Very often in behavior, we call this fantasy coping. Some people call it denial. If you take a look at the checkerboard on the left, and you'll notice there's two blocks A and B. If I said to you that those two blocks are the same color, what would you say? Take a look. When I draw in those parallel lines, it immediately becomes evident they really are. And yet there's an illusion that gives us the impression they're not. David Eagleman cited this example called Adelson's Illusion Index in his recent book, The Story of You. And he says, no one is having an experience of the same objective reality that really exists. Each creature, creatures being us, perceives only what it has evolved to perceive. Every creature assumes its slice of reality to be the entire objective world. Our objective reality has less to do with what's happening out there and more to do with what's happening inside our brain. You see, we don't perceive things as they are. We perceive them as we are. We don't see things, we don't see reality. We see what we think is reality. And so one way to maybe explain this is, imagine I go into a room full of objects and information, and I have a torch, and I shine that torch in the room. I will only see what the torch illuminates. And from that, I will gather an impression of what the whole room is about, but I won't be seeing the whole room. In fact, I'll be missing a majority of what's in the room. And life in some ways is like this. And what happens is we select the data we see, we add to it our own meaning, our experience, past experiences, and our history, our cultural values get imbued into that. We start to make assumptions from what we are assuming, and we start to draw conclusions. We take a position of certain beliefs, and then fundamentally on that, we take certain actions and decisions, just like those education technology investors and committees did way back then. This, by the way, is called the ladder of inference. So self-awareness, when you invest time in your self-awareness, what you literally increase is your ability to discern reality. You're never going to see the full picture, but you're going to certainly widen what you illuminate and notice in the room. Your behavior for personal transformation is calibrated by your level of self-awareness. And this is why I say, if you work in no other area, work in this area. Today, I could have gone into topics such as relaxation and intention to talk about things like breath, non-judgmental observation. We actually touched on that by looking at those exercises we just did. And we could have talked about the act of contemplation and introspection and the attitudes that foster self-awareness. But one thing that I do want to leave with you is self-awareness is not a chore. It's not a thing to tick off the to-do list or a punishment for when you don't do things right. In fact, it's best done with the act of self-compassion. Being kind to yourself is fundamental to self-awareness development. And there's a beautiful poem by Derek Walcott, Love After Love. I'll read the first two stanzas because I think they really speak to this act of self-compassion. The time will come when with elation you will greet yourself arriving at your own door, in your own mirror, and each will smile at the other's welcome and say, sit here, eat. Will love again the stranger who was yourself. Give wine, give bread, give back to your heart, to itself, to the stranger who has loved you all your life, ignored. Let's take a jump then to the next building block, self-management. And self-management is really built on two fundamentals: the ability to take responsibility for your actions, for your behavior, and then to convert that into effective self-regulation, to leverage that ability to literally regulate effective behavior day to day. One of the areas that crops up a lot is stress. People, when we talk about self-regulation, inevitably the topic of stress crops up. By the way, I put in this quote, I just love what it says. It says, self-management really is fundamentally, you are who you practice to be. You become who you practice to be. We become that by doing, not by thinking. So as I said, let me then speak to you of stress, and I'm going to present to you what is called the general adaptation syndrome. It's a way of explaining stress and the process of stress in the human body. Now, imagine that you wake up and something particularly happens. You're late for a meeting, you get stuck in traffic, you receive distressing news on the phone, or within a board context, there's some serious conflict. Immediately, the human biology recognizes that there is a stressor and goes through a process of labeling the stressor. We either label it as a threat, not a threat. If it's perceived as not a threat, we've literally compared the stressor to a whole bunch of things in our database, and we've said, this is not a threat, then our biology will remain relatively unchanged. However, if we perceive it as a threat, then our body will go into an acute state of response, which we often call the fight, flight, or fight stage, where the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and the adrenal gland will react, actually cavort a whole series of hormones and other chemicals into our blood, accelerating our heart rate, changing our breathing to be more shallow, and really preparing us to deal with this acute stress or this immediate perceived danger. The sympathetic nervous system, the automatic nervous system, will be switched on, and we will be acutely ready to deal with the stress. But modern life being what it is, stress isn't really a sort of once in a while event. It tends to be a day-long, day-to-day event for most of us. In fact, modern stress has changed remarkably. We are stressed all the time. It's just really the degree of stress during the course of the day. Additionally, much of what we stress about is not necessarily real anymore. We worry about things that generally don't necessarily happen, but their worry sits with us consistently. For example, will I have enough to retire? Will I be retrenched? Will my kids get a good education in this country? And so when our body becomes chronically stressed, we go into a more adaptive stage, which is more mediated by a long-acting stress hormone called cortisol. And more of the body's resources get focused on dealing with the stress. And then, unfortunately, what tends to happen is we have a situation where you're draining a lot of the body's energy. If this situation was to continue and worsen, eventually we'll get to a state where the body will become much more susceptible to disease, collapse, and death. Now, I want to point out that many of us here today, there's 100 people in this room today, most of us are going to be in this resistant stage. We're going to perceive that we are coping with stress, we rationalize stress, but we carry it constantly. Very often we call this high functioning stress, and it is more of a health issue. The solution to this is to develop stress resilience. But something that I just want to point out further about the state of stress is that when we are stressed, our behavior and our thinking changes. If we take a look at the brain, which is really built in three main sections, the base of the brain is this reptilian part of the brain, which is very much its function is survival, primal instinct survival. And this is the part of the brain that really deals with when we are stressed, the fight, flight, fright syndrome is dealt with in this reptilian brain. Messages don't really make their way through to the neocortex, where we have more time to think about things before we act on them, where we have more time to be rational. And the development of EQ very much takes place in this neocortex. But if we're constantly stressed, we're going to be spending way more time in this reptilian phase of our brain, and they're not really able to think more clearly. There's a couple of books that really show this very well. One of them is Eric Burns' Games People Play. Very easy to read, and it really points out the difference between how we behave when we're stressed versus when we're relaxed. This in turn is going to change our performance and our behavior. I want to draw this topic to a close by talking about, this conversation wouldn't be complete without talking about power and control. And many of you will know these two circles, the circle of control and the circle of concern, from the work of Stephen Covey. And what he says is, if we put our energy into things that we can control, that are within our ability to control, such as what we eat, what we read, what we do in the morning, what we buy, how we spend our time, slowly but surely our circle of control will expand, our influence will expand. Whereas if we spend a lot of time putting our energy into things that we don't really have power over, we're concerned about politicians, about the economy, about inflation, about the weather, but we can't fundamentally change them. If we put all our time in there, we're going to slowly but surely lose the area where we do have control and lose our ability to have influence on our environment. This conversation has got a new dimension these days. More and more, we see the tussle between centralized control and between personal freedom, not only in society, but within organizations, where people are becoming more empowered personally, but are finding that there is still this top-down centralized control from the organization. And what we will find, for example, a prime example in South Africa was where it was said, look, nobody will be forced to take the vaccine during COVID. And then, of course, a couple of months later, we were touting the possibility of vaccine mandates, as some organizations did, even though the Constitution very much clearly gave the personal freedom and bodily autonomy to the individual. And so what I want to suggest is take a look at the circle on the right. This is the new area that is now a battleground of power and control, where as people perceive that there is more centralized control being forced upon them and their personal freedoms are being shrunk, they're going to be a lot more defensive, a lot more aggressive, and a lot more polar. This is part of their brain, and they're going to behave a lot more divisively. So in an organization, if you have heavy-handed centralized control, you're going to feel that pushback from the floor, as we can see in society. Julie, I'm very sort of mindful of time and wanting to give people also time for questions. There's a section at the very end I'd like to talk about self-performance and team performance, but I'm very tempted to jump and to really make time for more questions. I'm just wondering, you can see the chat, I can't. What is your sense?
Hi, Mark. Yes, I think we have a lot of listeners today. We've got one question in the Q&A. So I think based on this, I think the audience is very keen to listen a little bit longer, and maybe we can start taking questions at about 1:45, if that's okay. It gives about 15 minutes for questions. We can reassess
100%.
once if more questions start coming through, but I think we're listening today, not asking. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Fantastic. So then let's jump onto the topic of social awareness. Once you've gained that self-awareness, now the ability to understand others and have skills in them, treating them accordingly with empathy and flexibility really becomes relevant. And something I want to share with you here is a topic that isn't often discussed, but I think is really important to raise. This is Ignaz Semmelweis. He was a doctor in the Austrian General Hospital in 1847. And he is best known for discovering that the simple act of washing hands when in the maternal wards reduced the death rate from childbed fever by 50%. Washing of the hands is one of the most important clinical discoveries in medicine, along, believe it or not, with the modern toilet. But what he's lesser known for is that he made an observation that in the ward, the babies closest to the door fared better compared to their counterparts further on, deeper in the ward. He noticed that they gained weight quicker, they had less infections, and generally they fared better. And he realized that this had to do with the fact that they got more attention from passing visitors. As they came past the door, they looked in, looked at the cute baby. These babies got more attention and fared better. For this, he was ridiculed. However, now we know that in fact he was onto something. For if a baby is starved of tactile touch, of affection, and of attention, their health will suffer. In the extreme, they will develop a condition called deprivation dwarfism, in which they have retarded growth, mental growth, and in fact tend to live shorter lives. So this conversation around loneliness and isolation is one that's been coming for a long time. The 2018 Cigna study in the US surveyed 20,000 Americans amongst different age groups on areas of isolation and loneliness. And it concluded that loneliness had become epidemic and has the same impact on mortality as smoking 15 cigarettes a day, making it clinically even more dangerous than obesity. Across, and the figures you see here, by the way, these are percentages of those who experience isolation or loneliness. And across the age groups, it was very noticeable that younger generations experience higher levels of loneliness compared to their older counterparts. So much so that Theresa May appointed the first Minister of Loneliness, Tracy Crouch, during her term, and more recently, Japan appointed its first Minister of Loneliness to deal with a work-related suicide that was happening in Japan. It's really then, let's bring it to what is relevant here. And already in 20 Business Review, Thomas Saporita wrote an article conveying a study that showed that 50% of CEOs surveyed expressed feelings of loneliness, 61% of which believed that loneliness hindered their job performance. If anything really came out of lockdown, one of the things that hit the headlines a lot was mental stress and mental health. But I would say to you that the issue of mental health and mental stress has been coming for many years. It was just heightened by lockdown. And you can see a recent Gallup poll really showing what they call the global rise of unhappiness, indexes of anger, stress, sadness, anxiety, and so forth, reaching record highs. And so it's really important to have this kind of conversation. And one of the areas that we're aware of is the fact that we very much live by a screen. Even today, I am meeting you in a two-dimensional sense. You are seeing me through a representation of me. You are not sitting close to me in this room. And my theory is that this very much has an effect. The experiment that I want to particularly refer to is often one that's referred to when we talk about the use of authority and submission. They were called the Milgram experiments. And in these experiments, what actually happened was there would be a person who came in, an unknowing individual as a tester, who would be asking questions to a person in another room called the learner. But this learner was hooked up through an electric device that could give them shocks, the device being controlled by the tester. The tester would ask a series of questions, and if the learner got the answer wrong, they would administer them a small shock. In the room was also an experimenter who would issue instructions to the tester, the main instruction being that as the experiment went on and as the learner kept getting their answers wrong, they had to keep increasing the voltage. Now, I think I need to point it out that the person in this room was in on the experiment. The screams of agony when they received the shocks, because they were screams of agony, were in fact fake. They were recordings. This person wasn't really being shocked, but it was a setup. It was very much used to look at authority. But what's really interesting to see is this. People obeyed orders to deliver shocks to other people, even when recipients were clearly in pain. 68% of the participants delivered the maximum potentially lethal shock of 450 volts. So just to be very clear with that, 68% of the people in this experiment, if they administered that shock in real time, really, 68% of those people in the other room would have died. The fact is they could hear the person in the room but not see them. And this is a bit like Twitter and Tinder and so many other environments nowadays. We don't see everything about a person when we are engaging with them through a screen. We can't see the nuances and inflections in their face, the body language that comes across, the subtlety, the mood in the room. We just see what we see. Very often it's a blank screen. Very often it's just their name. And so into that space, we project, again, it's like a torch. We only see part of the room. We project into that room, into that space, a whole bunch of other personal projections. And this is, for example, exactly what happens in Twitter. Somebody says something, and without you knowing that person, without understanding their context, without knowing them, where they're coming from, their values, immediately people tend to react and project, and it becomes a very hostile environment. Connection is real. This is not an airy-fairy concept. Biologically, it's very real. If we take two people and we put them in an environment where they slowly but surely start forming a relationship, start forming a bond, what you will see when you start taking their brain ECGs is their brain EEGs, is you will notice that there seems to be a synchronization in the empathetic centers of their brain. They literally form a connection and act in unison. My computer literally just jumped into the next slide, I think telling me it's time to go to relationship management. And here it's very much the pivotal moment of now being able to convert all this to form relationships. And in this area, I'm actually going to say very little, but I'm really wanting to talk about this because I notice time and again that this is where organizations fall. They've failed down. We take people, we're a very diverse country, different cultures, economically different. We put all these people in an organization, we put them under huge deadline pressure, economic pressure, and we expect them to perform. We expect somebody like a Kit Kat and a tomato sauce come along, and without much support, we expect them to make a gourmet meal. Time and again, companies do not put enough resources into onboarding, inducting, and orientating staff, not just new staff, but teams towards each other. Bar one board and committee that I've been on, virtually every other has never either conducted such a process to bring us together to work as a team, or has done so very transactionally and very poorly. And if you want to improve your relationship management personally or within your organization, I would suggest start looking at the processes that get people to sit commonly together, to find common ground. Start with that. So then I want to just go in and talk a little bit about performance. I'm noticing that my time is up, so I'm going to jump along this for the moment. And I want to just talk about something in the area of, and we can always in the Q&A come back to performance, but I want to talk about in this area of leadership, team performance, and governance. There are a couple of things that often come up as questions from directors, and I think it's worth sharing. Inevitably, you yourself will either be asked to coach and mentor others in your team, or you may yourself be coaching and receive coaching and mentoring. You may also find that it's expected of you to learn the skills to be able to self-mentor yourself through a process. And the fundamental change that has happened in coaching, you can see it in performance sport. And Paddy Upton, in his book, The Barefoot Coach, which I strongly recommend you read, Paddy's a fellow Cape Townian, and I remember him when he was studying his master's, and he was really saying that the role of coaching has changed. It's no longer going to be a situation where the coach dictates and the player follows these instructions. If you follow modern sports performance now, you will see that it is very much moving towards player-centered coaching. In other words, it is the player who decides, do I need to practice today? When should we practice? What is it I need to perform better? And it's the role of the coach and the mentor to motivate, to support, and facilitate rather than to dictate. It's a massive change in relationship. The person still needs to perform, performance management still counts, and you still need to choose the right people. But the role of a coach and a mentor has fundamentally changed, and it should change within organizations. The second thing that I want to share is we often talk about boardroom culture. And I want to bring the cultural conversation to a bit more of a South African context and point out a couple of things that generally don't get spoken about. The first is that in South Africa, the language of governing bodies and of business in general is not the majority language of people in this country. And it's really quite shocking that more than 20 years later, isiXhosa and isiZulu are still not mandatory first languages in the South African schooling system. And yet we expect people to perform when they're fundamentally working with a language that's not their first language. I really recommend you go on YouTube. I've put the link in the presentation here. Go look at a video made 20 years ago called Sink or Swim by Neville Alexander. And when you see it, it really hits you as to how unrealistic it is to expect people whose first language is not English to perform at the same level of others for whom are very comfortable in that language environment. The second is that there are multi-cultures in this country, and they all have very different societal norms around how they, for example, perform with manners and etiquette, how they reach decisions. And these societal norms, we have a certain impression, perhaps, of how these norms should occur within a boardroom, and yet there is a conversation to be had taking into account the cultural diversity in the room. I found this out very strongly when I ran an incubator for isiXhosa informal builders about 3 years ago. It was really profound. All the decision-making was done by consensus, was not top-down. And then finally, it's really worth understanding that for many cultures, not just in South Africa, but globally, cultural values supersede governance values. There are many cultures, for example, where it is fundamental to not let your family member go hungry. And so whilst corruption is not excusable, there are behavioral roots that might see people behaving in, for example, ways of nepotism or favoring people that in governance terms would be seen as improper. These are conversations that need to start happening throughout organizations. Finally, I want to leave on the topic of ethics, and there is no doubt in my mind that ethics, the ethics of a board, is determined by the sum and weight of the behavioral intelligence in the room. There's no doubt. But I think what we often get lost on is we talk about the ethics within the boardroom, the focus on the directors within the boardroom, the conflict, and very much on the shareholders. But as you'll know, the King Code has shifted the emphasis to creating value for stakeholders, not just for shareholders. And not only is it for, we are responsible for what happens now, but what happens down the line. That EdTech example that I showed you earlier today, what I didn't mention was the non-financial impacts. When those stocks dropped, there were massive layoffs. There are currently massive layoffs in the EdTech industry, retrenchments, often immediate retrenchments without notice. Many companies have closed, and that has a real human effect. So the behavioral intelligence in that room has a definite ethical consequence that is playing out right now at this very moment in countries around the world. Julie, I'm going to just end off. I'm going to say one last thing. I'm not going to share what John said, but I'm just going to share, you know, many people, years ago, we used to talk about behavior as a soft skill. I can tell you behavior is not a soft skill. It's a tough journey. And many people say, yeah, we really got to do this. But the minute they get back to the office and the stress happens. It's a bit like that gym membership. It's a great idea. You want to go, but you don't actually do it. But I can tell you this now, that the fundamental competitive advantage for you personally and for your organization is behavior. It is the sharp end of the spear. It is not a soft skill. It is work that's quite hard to do, but it is worthwhile. These are all the topics that I've covered. The ones in yellow are things that I've tried to cover. I missed out a couple here. These in pink are all the topics that I could have addressed in the behavioral spectrum. I think I'm wanting to really stop at this point, Julie, and let's take time for discussion and questions. You've been monitoring the chat. See where we go.
Thanks, Mark. Much appreciated. Henk has asked a question here. He's asking, if over 60% of this audience believes that behavioral intelligence is important, what holds us back from driving the dramatic change needed in our world?
If I had the time, I would love to survey the people in the room. This perception, their perceptions alone would be very telling, right? We've understood now that perception and reality literally sit side by side, but not necessarily in the same chair. What I can share with you is my impression is this. We've lived through a time where it's a bit like the restaurant and the kitchen. We would like our lives to be like the front of house in a restaurant. It's all perfect. The tables are laid out beautifully. The meal looks fantastic. But if you go in the kitchen, it's chaos. And we live in a comparison culture. And so time and again, for reasons of ego, reasons of feeling guilty and shame, we feel that we're not doing enough. And so I think that, the guilt, the fear, the shame really at a fundamental level prevents organizations from making the changes. And there's a reasonable fear. For boards, the fear of the unknown, you don't want to put an organization at risk. Absolutely. But maybe I can round off this question by saying this. And John Kabat-Zinn, who I unfortunately didn't mention, has this beautiful saying. He says, look, and he's speaking about meditation, but I use it for behavior. He says, if you sew a parachute one day at a time, one thread at a time, day by day, you'll start building a parachute. And when you need to jump out of the plane, it will save you. But if you don't start sewing that parachute today and you jump out of the plane, well, you're going to get the same old results and worse. And so organizations don't need to make these massive upheavals to start bringing behavioral intelligence into their organization. It's really actually best done slowly, slowly, slowly over a longer period of time, not radically. And if you do that, I think those fear elements will be less present. But there has to be an entry point and a willingness.
Thanks, Mark. I'm just busy following all the chats on the side. Everyone's loving what you're saying. They really find it really insightful, extremely thought-provoking. I have a question I'd like to ask you. How does culture play a role in behavior in the leadership and governance space? Just bringing it back to our directors. Could you just go over that question for us?
Okay. Sure. This can be a long answer, and I don't want to do that. Let's put it this way. Culture is, if we had to make a very simple definition of culture, it's the way of life of an organization. And the way of life of an organization is formed very often by the original founders who set the tone and set the vision and the mission and the purpose. And from there on, you hope that this translates through the organization and the organization as a whole adopts it. In the leadership space, culture is often very legacy orientated. This is the way we have done things in the past, and it's predictable, and so we carry on with it. Julia, I want to just ask, just repeat the question a bit to me, because I think there's something that I'm missing, and I don't want to go off at a tangent.
Sure. How does culture play a role in behavior in the leadership and governance space?
Okay, yeah, so fortunately I was on it. it's very much then that, you know, that culture becomes established. It's the way of the life of this board. It's the way we do things here. And when diversity, and you very often find that boards and committees and organizations then tend to, with a good intention, it's not a bad intention, it's a good intention to preserve that, because obviously that legacy has worked in some way, that culture has worked in some way. It might have benefited the organization, or it might have benefited some people within the organization. And there will be a resistance to change that. And so this is one of the resistances you see towards them bringing diversity, because boards by their very nature are risk averse, right? So you don't want to bring people into the room that you feel might bring such radical change and upset the boat. This is really the drama that plays out. What I would say is boards that do not, you know, it's that extrapolation curve. The world is changing, and boards, and I think the presenters last month said the exact same thing. If you are not open to transforming as a board, you stand the risk of becoming irrelevant. You may already be irrelevant. The world does not stay frozen in time. Let me leave it at that for now.
Thanks, Mark. Vusi has got his hand up. Oh, no, he's just put his hand down. Okay, I think there was an audience member who wanted to ask a question. We have one last question here. It's from Nanda. Just a scenario. If employees didn't get a salary increase over the past 5 years and the cost of living is increasing, what does this do to employees' behavior if management is driving cost-cutting measures?
Yeah. So sadly, this is I feel your pain. This is a reality. And so essentially, behaviorally, what's going to be happening is it's going to be stressful to that person, right? Time and again, you feel you're being passed over. And so your behavior is going to start shifting into the basal part of your brain. You're going to start becoming more defensive, more reactive, more aggressive, less assertive, less communicative, less emotionally intelligent. And so organizations that do this time and again, everything we do goes somewhere. Eventually, people are going to either leave, or they're going to start playing truant, or they're going to start misbehaving. At an operational level, they're not going to perform. And at an executive level, they're going to become stale and demotivated. And they're going to start trying to, at the executive level, as the operational level doesn't perform, they're going to try and correct this with more sort of authoritative top-down measures, which don't work. It's vital that organizations realize that if you ignore the needs of individuals in your organization and you don't support your staff to perform better, they're not going to perform better. People are people.
Thanks, Mark. This has really been such a great conversation starter and discussion. I think it's not really discussion because we all just want to listen to you, but there have been a few questions coming through, and I think we picking up that people would like to have a longer session, so maybe we'll chat about that offline. Okay. This brings us to a close. I just want to remind everyone that a video of this will be available online afterwards. And if Mark, if you'd just like to stop sharing, and I'm just going to share my last screen because I really want to hear back from our audience members on this. Please scan the QR code. And just a reminder to our members that these videos are available online, and if you want to have it on your phone, you can access it through our member app. Our member app is free for all our IODSA members, so please go look for your app in the App Store. I think it is just called IODSA membership app. It has all these videos and all these, all our thought leadership and basically everything at your fingertips. But let's just get back to this fantastic presentation. Mark, thank you very much. You have really shared such great information. And I wish everyone a great day. Please go away and think about these bits of information and what they mean to you and how you can implement or change things within your own environment. Thank you, Mark, and thank you, audience. We'll see you again next month. Cheerio, everyone. Bye.
Thank you so much. Take care. Bye-bye.